With just $15,000 standing between her mother and death, Zara Thompson was counting every minute until her next paycheck, when a wrong turn through the most exclusive hotel in Seoul led her straight into the dangerous world of Kim Jae-won, a man whose power could solve all her problems or destroy her completely. At 24, Zara balanced the demanding schedule of a senior event coordinator at the Sheila Seoul with the relentless pressure of her mother's mounting medical bills. She was practical, focused, and knew the value of every dollar that slipped through her fingers toward yet another specialist appointment, another experimental treatment, another desperate attempt to buy time. Her natural hair was pulled back in a sleek protective style that had lasted 3 weeks because she couldn't afford frequent salon visits, and her dark eyes held the kind of exhaustion that came from working double shifts and sleeping in hospital waiting rooms. She was driven by an uncompromising vision, her mother healthy, her family whole, and a world where cancer didn't dictate every financial decision. The Sheila's VIP floor was supposed to be empty at 11:30 on a Tuesday night. Zara climbed the marble staircase with careful steps, her heels echoing in the pristine silence, carrying the leather portfolio that had been left in conference room B after the evening's corporate event. The portfolio was custom-made, expensive, the kind of item that someone important would definitely want returned immediately. She'd volunteered to deliver it personally because every overtime hour meant another $100 toward the impossible mountain of debt that seemed to grow faster than she could climb it. She pushed through the heavy mahogany door marked private and stopped immediately. This wasn't conference room B. The VIP lounge was dimly lit by crystal chandeliers, decorated in rich burgundy leather and dark wood that screamed old money and newer power. 5 men in expensive suits sat around a low table covered with documents, tablets, and what appeared to be architectural blueprints. The conversation stopped the moment she entered, 5 pairs of eyes turning toward her with varying degrees of surprise, calculation, and something that made her blood run cold. One man stood immediately. He was Korean, late 30s, with sharp features and dark hair swept back in a style that suggested both control and wealth. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, the kind that cost more than her monthly salary. His presence dominated the room despite his calm demeanor, and when his dark eyes met hers, everything stopped. "I'm so sorry," Zara said quickly, taking a step backward. "Wrong room. I was looking for conference room B to return this portfolio." The man who'd been speaking when she entered reached for something inside his jacket, but the Korean man raised his hand slightly, a gesture so subtle it barely qualified as movement. Everyone in the room froze. "Conference room B is on the floor below," he said quietly. His English was perfect, precise, with only the faintest hint of an accent. "What's in the portfolio?" "Just corporate documents from tonight's event." Zara held up the leather case, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. "I work for the hotel. Event coordination. Someone left this behind." His eyes moved from her face to her hands, noting the slight tremor she couldn't quite control, then to the portfolio, then back to her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed. She should leave. She should turn around and walk out and pretend she'd never seen whatever this meeting was about. But something in his expression held her still. "You look tired," he observed. "Long day. Double shift." Her automatic response came out before she could think about whether answering personal questions from strange men in private rooms was smart. "How long have you been working double shifts?" The question was casual, conversational, but there was something underneath it that suggested he already suspected the answer. "Since my mother got sick. About 8 months now." She shouldn't have said that. She definitely shouldn't have given personal information to a man who radiated the kind of controlled danger that made her instincts scream warnings. But his attention felt different from the leering stares she got from drunk conference attendees or the dismissive glances from wealthy guests who saw hotel staff as furniture. He was listening to her answers like they mattered. "What kind of sick?" he asked. "Cancer." The word came out flat, matter of fact, because that's how she'd trained herself to say it. "Lung cancer. Stage 3. She needs surgery that insurance won't cover." "How much?" $15,000 for the surgery. Another 10 for the follow-up treatments. Maybe more. The honesty escaped before she could stop it, along with the exhaustion that made her voice crack slightly on the numbers. Kim Jae-won studied her face for a long moment, taking in the shadows under her eyes. The careful way she held herself upright despite obvious fatigue, the defensive set of her shoulders that said she was used to fighting battles alone. The portfolio in her hands was expensive, but her uniform was perfectly maintained despite being clearly worn. Her shoes were polished, but showed signs of long hours on her feet. Everything about her spoke of someone trying desperately to maintain dignity while drowning. "You could have listened to our conversation," he said finally. "Important business information. Worth a lot of money to the right people." "I wasn't listening." Zara met his gaze directly, her voice steady. "I don't want to know your business. I just want to return this and go home. But you did hear some things." "Maybe. But I work in hospitality. Client confidentiality is part of my job. I don't repeat what I overhear." Something shifted in his expression, a slight softening around his eyes that suggested approval. He reached into his jacket, the same motion that had made his associate reach for a weapon, but he pulled out a business card instead. Heavy paper, minimal text, just a name and phone number in both Korean and English. "Kim Jae-won," he said, offering the card. "Zara Thompson." She took the card automatically, noting the weight of the paper, the expensive feel of real cardstock. The kind of business card that meant serious money. "When you're ready to stop handling impossible situations alone, call me," Kim Jae-won said. His voice was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "I have experience with problems that seem unsolvable. Why would you help me? You don't even know me. Let's just say I have resources for situations where traditional solutions aren't enough." His dark eyes held hers steadily. "And I recognize someone who deserves better than the hand they've been dealt." The other men in the room had remained silent throughout the entire exchange, but Zara could feel their attention like a physical weight. Whatever Kim Jae-won was, whatever this meeting was about, it was important enough that 5 powerful-looking men deferred to his judgment about what to do with an accidental witness. "I should go," she said quietly. "Yes, you should. But keep the card, Zara Thompson, in case you change your mind about handling things alone." She nodded, slipping the card into her uniform pocket, and turned toward the door. Her hand was on the handle when he spoke again. "The portfolio. You still need to return it to conference room B." She looked back at him, noting the slight curve at the corner of his mouth that might have been amusement. "Right. Conference room B, floor below." "Floor below," he confirmed. "And Zara, be careful walking alone at night. So can be dangerous for women carrying valuable items." The warning sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She nodded once and left, pulling the door closed behind her with careful quiet. In the hallway, her hands were shaking. She pressed her back against the wall for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. She'd walked into some kind of business meeting that was clearly not the corporate consulting she'd assumed from the expensive suits and professional setting. The other men's automatic reach for weapons, the way they'd all deferred to Kim Jae-won's authority, the casual way he'd talked about resources for unsolvable problems, all pointed towards something that had nothing to do with legitimate business. But he'd been kind. Strange, intense, clearly dangerous, but kind. And he'd offered help when no one else had even acknowledged that she needed it. Zara walked to the elevator, portfolio still in hand, Kim Jae-won's business card burning like a secret in her pocket. Conference room B was indeed on the floor below, and the corporate documents inside the portfolio were exactly what she'd expected them to be, nothing unusual or valuable enough to justify the careful attention she'd received upstairs. By the time she finished her shift at 1 in the morning and rode the subway home to her cramped studio apartment, she'd almost convinced herself that the encounter had been a strange dream brought on by exhaustion and stress. But the business card was real, heavy and expensive in her pocket, and the memory of Kim Jae-won's dark eyes studying her face with an intensity that suggested he saw more than just another tired hotel employee. She pulled out the card as she unlocked her apartment door, reading his name again in the dim hallway light. Kim Jae-won, a name that sounded like it belonged to someone important, someone with the kind of power that could solve problems that seemed impossible. The kind of problems like $25,000 for medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover and a bank account that hadn't seen 4 digits since her mother's diagnosis. She should throw the card away. Getting involved with a man who attended private meetings with armed associates would be the stupidest decision in a year full of desperate choices. But instead, she slipped the card into her wallet next to her mother's hospital ID bracelet, and the photo of them together from before cancer had stolen 30 pounds and most of her mother's energy. Maybe morality was a luxury she couldn't afford. Maybe survival meant considering options that her old life would have rejected without question. Maybe walking into the wrong room had been exactly the right thing to do. 3 days after her encounter with Kim Jae-won, Zara sat in the hospital cafeteria staring at her mother's latest medical bills with the kind of desperation that made smart people consider stupid options. The surgery consultation had added another $5,000 to the total, bringing the impossible number to $30,000. And her mother's oncologist had used words like rapidly progressing and time-sensitive that translated to either find money immediately or start planning a funeral. Her phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the hotel. Extra shift tonight if you want it. VIP event, good tips potential. She responded yes immediately because every dollar mattered, even though she'd already worked 6 days straight and her feet were permanently swollen from standing in heels for 12-hour stretches. But $30,000. Even working every available hour. Even if she somehow managed to save every penny of her paycheck, she would need 3 years to accumulate that kind of money. Her mother didn't have 3 months, much less 3 years. The business card felt heavy in her wallet. Kim Jae-won's name printed in elegant black letters on cream-colored paper that probably cost more per sheet than she made in an hour. She'd pulled it out twice in the past 3 days, staring at the phone number and wondering what kind of help a man like that would offer and what the price would be. Instead, she'd spent her off hours researching other options. Medical loans, charity foundations, crowdfunding campaigns that seemed to raise dozens of dollars instead of thousands. Every legitimate avenue led to the same conclusion: not enough money, not enough time, not enough hope. Which was how she ended up in a coffee shop in Hongdae at 10 in the morning, sitting across from a man who'd responded to her desperate internet search for emergency loans with a promise of same-day funding and flexible repayment terms. Lee Min-wo looked respectable enough in his pressed shirt and conservative tie, like a bank manager or insurance agent, but something about his smile made her skin crawl. $30,000 is a significant amount, Lee Min-wo said, reviewing the financial documents she'd brought. Your income-to-debt ratio is concerning. What collateral can you provide? I don't have property or assets. Just my income from the hotel. Zara kept her voice steady, professional, the same tone she used when dealing with difficult guests who demanded impossible accommodations. I can provide employment verification, references, whatever you need. Unfortunately, traditional collateral isn't sufficient for this loan amount. He leaned forward, his eyes traveling down her body in a way that made her want to take a shower. However, we do have alternative arrangements for young women in desperate situations. What kind of alternative arrangements? Personal service contracts. You would work directly for our organization until the debt is satisfied. We have many business interests that require attractive, intelligent women. Entertainment, hospitality, private client services. The words sounded professional, but the way he said them made her stomach turn. Private client services. Entertainment that required attractive women. Alternative arrangements for desperate people who had no other options. What exactly would I be doing? Whatever our clients require. Lee Min-wo's smile widened, showing too many teeth. Travel, companionship, special accommodations for VIP guests. The work can be quite lucrative if you're cooperative. Zara's blood ran cold as the real meaning of his words sank in. This wasn't a legitimate loan company. These men were predators who targeted desperate women and offered money in exchange for sexual servitude. The kind of arrangement that started with private clients and ended with women disappearing into trafficking networks. I think I misunderstood what kind of loan this was, she said carefully, starting to gather her documents. I'm looking for a traditional financial arrangement. Lee Min-wo's hand shot out and clamped around her wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. You came to us, Miss Thompson. You made an appointment, took up our time, discussed your desperate situation. It would be rude to leave without hearing our complete offer. Let go of me. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs hard enough that she could hear it in her ears. $30,000, available today. His grip tightened. Or you can watch your mother die while you work your little hotel job for minimum wage and tips. Your choice. Other people in the coffee shop were staring now, but no one moved to help. Lee Min-wo looked like a businessman having a conversation with a client, and she looked like a young woman getting upset about financial matters. Nothing unusual enough to warrant intervention. My choice is to leave. She stood up, pulling against his grip. Right now? I don't think so. Lee Minwo stood as well, his hand still locked around her wrist. We invested time in researching your situation, Miss Thompson. Your mother's medical records, your employment history, your financial status. We know you have nowhere else to turn. We know you're desperate enough to consider options you would have rejected 6 months ago. How did you get my mother's medical records? We have connections throughout Seoul. Hospitals, banks, government offices, police departments. We know exactly how desperate you are, and we know no one will miss you if you disappear for a few years of service work. Terror flooded her system, cold and absolute. This man wasn't just threatening financial manipulation. He was threatening kidnapping, human trafficking, the kind of disappearance that families spent years searching for without ever finding answers. Let me go, or I'll scream. Go ahead. Lee Minwo glanced around the coffee shop dismissively. Even if someone calls the police, we have arrangements with local authorities. You'll be processed as a voluntary worker who changed her mind after signing contracts. By the time anyone investigates, you'll be working in a private club in another country. She looked around desperately, noting the other customers who were pointedly avoiding eye contact, the baristas who were busy with equipment maintenance, the security camera that was conspicuously angled away from their table. This meeting had been arranged deliberately, in a location where they had control and she had no protection. Let go of her. The voice came from directly behind Lee Minwo, low and steady and carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the coffee shop freeze. Zara looked up to see Kim Jae-won standing less than 2 feet away, his expensive suit immaculate, his dark eyes focused on Lee Minwo's hand with the kind of attention that suggested violence was a distinct possibility. This is a private business discussion, Lee Minwo said without turning around. Move along. Kim Jae-won took 1 step closer, close enough that his presence became overwhelming, close enough that the temperature in the coffee shop seemed to drop 10 degrees. I said let go of her. Lee Minwo released her wrist immediately and turned to face Kim Jae-won, his confident demeanor shifting to something that looked like nervous calculation. Sir, this is a private financial consultation. We're discussing loan terms with Miss Thompson. Kim Jae-won's gaze moved from Lee Minwo to Zara, taking in her pale face, the red marks on her wrist, the documents scattered across the table. His expression didn't change, but something cold and dangerous settled behind his eyes. Miss Thompson. Kim Jae-won's voice was gentle when he addressed her, completely different from the deadly quiet he'd used with Lee Minwo. Are you here voluntarily? I thought I was meeting with a legitimate loan company. Her voice came out shakier than she intended. I was wrong. I see. Kim Jae-won looked back at Lee Minwo, who had taken several steps backward but was still trying to maintain the appearance of professional authority. And you are? Lee Minwo from Sunrise Financial Solutions. We provide alternative funding for clients who don't qualify for traditional loans. Kim Jae-won pulled out his phone and said something in rapid Korean. Within seconds, he received a response that made him smile, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes at all. Lee Minwo from Sunrise Financial Solutions, Kim Jae-won repeated thoughtfully. Also known as Minwo the Recruiter, wanted by Interpol for human trafficking, currently operating under a fake business license, with outstanding warrants in 3 countries. Lee Minwo went pale. Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. No misunderstanding. You target desperate women, offer money they can't refuse, then force them into sexual slavery. Kim Jae-won took another step forward, and Lee Minwo stumbled backward into a chair. The question is whether you disappear quietly or whether I make an example of you. Who are you? Lee Minwo whispered. Someone you should have researched before targeting women under my protection. The coffee shop had emptied during the conversation, customers finding sudden urgent reasons to leave, staff disappearing into back rooms, leaving them alone with the kind of privacy that suggested this location had been cleared deliberately. Zara realized that Kim Jae-won's appearance hadn't been coincidental. He'd been watching, waiting, protecting her without her knowledge. Leave, Kim Jae-won said quietly. Leave Seoul tonight. If I see you again, if I hear about you operating anywhere in Korea, if you contact Miss Thompson or anyone in her family, you will disappear permanently. Do you understand? Lee Minwo nodded frantically, gathering his papers with shaking hands, not making eye contact with either of them. He practically ran out of the coffee shop, leaving behind the professional facade and revealing the predator underneath. Kim Jae-won watched him leave, then turned his attention to Zara, his expression softening immediately. "Are you injured?" "My wrist is sore, but nothing serious." She looked down at the red marks where Lee Min-wo had gripped her, evidence of how quickly her desperate search for help had turned into a nightmare. "How did you know I was here?" "I've been monitoring your situation since we met. When you started researching emergency loans and making appointments with unlicensed lenders, I became concerned. You've been watching me, protecting you." Kim Jae-won's voice was matter-of-fact, no apology for the invasion of privacy. "Women who encounter my business meetings accidentally sometimes become targets for people who think they can exploit the connection. I wanted to ensure your safety, so you followed me to a meeting with loan sharks. I had my people research everyone you contacted for financial assistance. Lee Min-wo's organization has a reputation for targeting desperate women with sick family members. I knew he would try to trap you." Zara sank back into her chair, the adrenaline crash leaving her shaky and exhausted. The reality of what had almost happened hit her like cold water. She'd been minutes away from signing papers that would have made her a voluntary victim of human trafficking, desperate enough for her mother's medical bills that she'd walked directly into the kind of trap that destroyed lives. $30,000, she said quietly. "I need $30,000, and I was willing to meet with human traffickers to get it. How did my life become this desperate?" Kim Jae-won sat down across from her, his movements careful and controlled. "Your life became desperate because you're trying to save someone you love, and our medical system prioritizes profit over human life. Desperation doesn't make you weak, Zara Thompson. It makes you human. But it almost made me a victim. Almost. But I was watching, and now you're safe." Kim Jae-won leaned forward slightly, his dark eyes serious and intent. "You need money immediately. I need someone trustworthy for legitimate business assistance. We can help each other." "What kind of business assistance?" "Translation services, administrative support, client relations for my legal enterprises. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal, nothing that would compromise your safety or integrity. And in exchange, your mother's medical bills paid immediately, your family's security insured, and a salary that would allow you to live comfortably without desperation." Zara studied his face, looking for the trap, the hidden price that would turn his offer into another form of exploitation. But his expression was steady, honest, the same controlled intensity she'd seen in the VIP lounge 3 days ago. "Why would you help me?" "Really? Because I recognize someone worth protecting. Because desperation shouldn't force good people into impossible choices." Kim Jae-won's voice was quiet but certain. "And because you walked into my business meeting by accident and proved your integrity by not trying to exploit what you overheard." "What's the catch?" "No catch. Just employment with someone who can afford to pay what you're worth and protect you from predators like Lee Min-wo." She thought about her mother lying in a hospital bed, about the medical bills that grew larger every day, about the legitimate jobs that would never pay enough to save someone she loved. She thought about Lee Min-wo's grip on her wrist and the coldness in his eyes when he talked about private client services and alternative arrangements. And she thought about Kim Jae-won appearing at exactly the right moment, removing a threat with quiet efficiency, offering help without demanding degradation in return. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course." Kim Jae-won reached into his jacket and pulled out a different business card, this one with an address embossed below his name. "When you're ready to discuss details, meet me here tomorrow evening at 7. If you decide this isn't right for you, no hard feelings and no consequences." He stood to leave, then paused. "Zara, if anyone else approaches you about loans or financial assistance, call me immediately. There are more predators like Lee Min-wo, and they all target the same desperate situations." She nodded, slipping the new card into her wallet next to the first one. "Thank you for helping me today." "Thank you for being worth helping," Kim Jae-won replied, and left her alone with her thoughts and the realization that she'd just been offered salvation by the most dangerous man she'd ever met. The address on Kim Jae-won's business card led to a glass tower in Gangnam that pierced the Seoul skyline like a monument to modern wealth and power. Zara stood on the sidewalk at 6:55 in the evening, staring up at the building that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkening sky. its windows reflecting the city lights in a pattern that looked like stars captured in crystal. The lobby was marble and steel, minimalist and expensive, the kind of space designed to remind visitors that they were entering a world where money moved in amounts that most people couldn't comprehend. The elevator required a keycard that the security guard provided after confirming her appointment, and it rose smoothly and silently to the 42nd floor without stopping. When the doors opened, she stepped directly into Kim Jae-won's private office, a space that redefined her understanding of corporate luxury. Floor-to-ceiling windows wrapped around 3 walls, offering a panoramic view of Seoul that made the city look like a living map spread out below them. The furniture was dark leather and polished steel, sleek lines and expensive materials that spoke of understated wealth rather than flashy display. A single desk dominated the center of the room, its surface empty except for a leather portfolio, 2 crystal glasses, and a bottle of whiskey that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The air smelled of leather and something woodsy that she recognized as Kim Jae-won's cologne, mixed with the faint scent of expensive electronics and perfectly controlled climate. Kim Jae-won stood with his back to the elevator, silhouetted against the city lights, wearing a charcoal suit that fit him like it had been cut specifically for his frame. When he turned to face her, his dark eyes held the same controlled intensity she remembered, but there was something softer in his expression, something that looked almost like relief. "Zara Thompson," he said, crossing the room to greet her. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for the invitation." Her voice was steadier than she felt, professional courtesy masking the nervousness that came from standing in a space that represented more wealth than she'd ever been exposed to. "Your office is impressive. It serves its purpose." Kim Jae-won gestured toward the leather chairs positioned near the windows, away from the imposing desk, creating a more intimate conversation area. "Please sit. Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee, tea, water?" "Water would be fine." She settled into the chair, noting how the leather was soft as silk and probably cost more than her entire wardrobe. Everything in the room spoke of success on a scale that made her hotel coordinator's salary seem like pocket change. He poured water from a crystal pitcher into glasses that caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the polished table surface. His movements were precise, controlled, the same careful attention to detail that she'd noticed in their previous encounters. "How is your mother?" he asked, taking the chair across from her. "Stable for now. The doctors want to schedule surgery as soon as possible, but—" She trailed off, the familiar weight of impossible numbers settling in her chest. "But you need $200,000 for the complete treatment protocol," Kim Jae-won finished quietly. "Surgery, chemotherapy, radiation, follow-up care, and the private room that will give her the best chance of recovery." "How did you know the exact amount?" "I had my people research the best possible treatment plan for her specific condition. Cost is rarely a barrier to optimal care when you have sufficient resources." Zara stared at him, processing the implications of what he'd just said. He'd researched her mother's medical condition without being asked, identified the most effective treatment options, and calculated the total cost before this meeting even began. The level of thoroughness suggested either incredible generosity or meticulous preparation for a business negotiation. "You researched my mother's cancer treatment." "I research everything that affects people under my protection." Kim Jae-won leaned forward slightly, his expression serious and intent. "Your mother has an 87% 5-year survival rate with the complete treatment protocol. 63% with the standard insurance-approved plan. The difference between those numbers is money, and money is a resource I have in abundance. Under your protection. You became my responsibility the moment you walked into that VIP lounge and chose integrity over opportunity." Kim Jae-won's voice was matter-of-fact, stating a conclusion rather than making a request. "The question now is whether you're willing to accept a formal arrangement that benefits both of us." "What kind of formal arrangement?" Kim Jae-won opened the leather portfolio on the table between them, revealing documents printed on heavy paper with legal letterhead. "Employment contract with Kim Enterprises, my legitimate business holdings. $200,000 paid immediately upon signing for your mother's complete medical care. $100,000 annual salary for personal assistant services. Full medical and dental coverage for you and your immediate family. Housing allowance or residential accommodation as needed. Personal assistant services for what exactly?" translation, and interpretation for my international business dealings. I conduct negotiations in Korean, Japanese, and English, and I need someone fluent in all three languages who understands cultural nuances. Administrative support for my legal enterprises, real estate development, import-export operations, technology investments. Client relations for high-net-worth individuals who require discretion and professionalism. Zara studied the contract pages, noting the legal language that looked legitimate and comprehensive. The salary number was more than double what she made at the hotel, and the immediate payment would cover not just her mother's surgery, but the complete treatment protocol that would give her the best possible chance of survival. What are the requirements? Availability when needed, which typically means standard business hours with occasional evening events. Absolute discretion regarding client information and business operations. Loyalty to Kim Enterprises and personal commitment to representing my interests professionally. Willingness to travel domestically and internationally as business requires. And what are the consequences if I violate those requirements? Immediate termination of employment and financial benefits. Kim Jae-won's voice was calm, but carried an undertone that suggested the consequences would extend beyond mere job loss. Legal action for breach of confidentiality. And loss of protection for you and your family. Protection from what? From people like Lee Min-wo who target vulnerable women. From competitors who might try to use you as leverage against my business interests. From anyone who would threaten your safety or your family's well-being. The words were spoken matter-of-factly, but they carried implications that made her stomach tighten. Protection meant that there were threats significant enough to require protection. It meant that working for Kim Jae-won would make her a target for people who wanted to hurt him. It meant entering a world where safety was not guaranteed and violence was a real possibility. What if I refused the position? Then you return to your hotel job. Your mother receives standard treatment with 63% survival odds, and you continue living with the kind of financial desperation that makes you vulnerable to predators. Kim Jae-won's expression didn't change, but his words carried the weight of inevitability. I will ensure that Lee Min-wo and his organization leave you alone, but there will be others. Desperation attracts predators like blood attracts sharks. So this isn't really a choice. Everything is a choice, Zara Thompson. The question is whether you choose the cage of poverty and vulnerability or the cage of wealth and protection. Both have restrictions. Both have prices. But only one of them saves your mother's life. She looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the city sprawling below them, millions of lights representing millions of people making impossible choices with inadequate resources. How many of them would kill for the opportunity she was being offered? How many would trade freedom for family, integrity for security, independence for the kind of money that solved every practical problem? You're asking me to trade my current life for a completely different existence. I'm offering you the resources to save someone you love and the protection to keep your family safe. Kim Jae-won's voice was gentle but implacable. The work is legitimate, the salary is generous, and the benefits extend to everyone you care about. What you're trading is uncertainty for security, struggle for comfort, powerlessness for protection. What about the illegal aspects of your business? You will have no involvement in activities that violate law or compromise your safety. Your role is limited to legitimate business operations that require discretion, but not criminality. You will never be asked to participate in anything that would put you at legal risk or moral compromise. But you do have illegal activities. I have business interests that operate in gray areas of international commerce. Kim Jae-won met her gaze directly, no evasion or deflection in his response. Import regulations, currency transfers, relationship management with government officials. Nothing that directly harms innocent people, but nothing that would satisfy a strict interpretation of every applicable law. So I would be working for a criminal. You would be working for a businessman who operates in industries where the line between legal and illegal is often determined by political relationships rather than moral absolutes. Kim Jae-won leaned back in his chair, his expression calm and certain. But your specific responsibilities would involve only legitimate business functions that any corporate assistant might perform. Zara stared at the contract, at the number that represented her mother's life, at the opportunity to transform her family's future with a single signature. The moral implications were clear. Accepting meant becoming complicit in whatever Kim Jae-won's organization did. even if her role was limited to legal activities. It meant trading her current struggles for a different kind of compromise, one that came with luxury and security, but also with danger and moral ambiguity. I need time to think about this. Of course. Kim Jae-won closed the portfolio and stood, moving to his desk to retrieve a sealed envelope. 24 hours to consider. If you decide to accept, sign the contracts and return them to this address. If you decide to decline, destroy the documents, and there will be no consequences or hard feelings. He handed her the envelope, his fingers brushing hers briefly, a contact that sent warmth through her despite the cool air conditioning. The envelope was heavy, expensive paper that felt substantial and important. What's in here? Complete contract terms, background information about Kim Enterprises, and a cashier's check for $50,000 as a good faith payment regardless of your decision. $50,000. For your mother's immediate medical needs while you consider the full arrangement. Kim Jae-won's expression was serious, intense, completely focused on her face. Whether you accept the position or not, your mother shouldn't suffer while you make this decision. Zara stared at the envelope in her hands, at the casual way he'd just handed her more money than she'd ever seen at one time, at the solution to months of desperate struggle offered without conditions or strings attached. Why are you doing this? Because desperate people make poor decisions, and I want you to choose freely rather than from desperation. Kim Jae-won moved closer, close enough that she could see the sincerity in his dark eyes, the careful control that suggested deep emotion held in check. Because your integrity impressed me, your strength deserves support, and your situation requires resources that I can provide. And if I take the money and run, then your mother receives treatment and you remain safe, and I consider it a worthwhile investment in human decency. Kim Jae-won smiled slightly, the first truly warm expression she'd seen from him. I don't think you're the type to take money and run, Zara Thompson. She stood up, the envelope feeling impossibly heavy in her hands, containing solutions to every problem that had kept her awake for months. $50,000 would cover her mother's surgery and several months of treatment. The full contract would provide complete medical care, financial security, and protection from the predators who targeted desperate women. All it would cost was her independence and her certainty about right and wrong. 24 hours, she said. 24 hours, Kim Jae-won confirmed. And Zara, whatever you decide, you've already proven that you're worth protecting. That won't change regardless of your choice. She left his office with the envelope clutched in her hands and her mind spinning with possibilities she'd never imagined. The elevator descended silently through 42 floors of expensive real estate, carrying her back to street level where the ordinary world waited with its ordinary problems and extraordinary impossibilities. But the envelope in her hands represented the possibility of a different kind of existence, one where money wasn't a constant source of stress, and her mother's survival wasn't dependent on insurance company decisions and government bureaucracy. 24 hours to choose between the life she knew and the life she could have. 24 hours to decide whether salvation was worth the price of working for a man whose kindness came wrapped in danger and whose protection required loyalty to activities she didn't fully understand. By the time she reached the hospital to visit her mother, she'd already made her decision. Watching her mother sleep in the narrow hospital bed, pale and thin and fighting a battle that required weapons they couldn't afford, made the moral complexity seem less important than the practical reality. Her mother deserved the 87% survival rate that money could buy. Her family deserved security and protection and the kind of future where medical bills didn't dictate every life choice. And maybe working for Kim Jae-won would teach her that the world was more complicated than simple categories of right and wrong, legal and illegal, safe and dangerous. Maybe survival required accepting that good people sometimes made morally ambiguous choices in order to protect the people they loved. The next evening, she returned to Kim Jae-won's office with signed contracts and the absolute certainty that she was trading one kind of life for another completely. When she handed him the documents, his smile was genuine and warm, and for the first time since her mother's diagnosis, Zara felt like the future held possibilities instead of just problems. Within an hour, $200,000 had been transferred to her mother's medical account. The best oncology team in Seoul had been contacted, and her family's financial crisis had been transformed into a manageable treatment plan with optimal outcomes. Her old life ended that night, and her new life as Kim Jae-won's assistant began with the understanding that some compromises were worth making when the alternative was watching someone you love die from problems that money could solve. 2 months after signing her contract with Kim Jae-won, Zara stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new apartment in Gangnam, watching the Seoul skyline stretch endlessly in all directions while her morning coffee grew cold in expensive porcelain that she still couldn't believe belonged to her. The apartment was modern luxury personified, sleek lines, neutral colors, and furniture that looked like it belonged in architectural magazines. Everything was pristine, comfortable, and completely foreign to someone who'd spent her adult life in cramped studios with thin walls and unreliable heating. Her mother's surgery had been successful beyond the doctor's most optimistic projections. The tumor had been completely removed, the margins were clear, and the follow-up chemotherapy was proceeding exactly according to the treatment protocol that had seemed impossibly expensive just 10 weeks ago. Her mother was gaining weight, regaining strength, and talking about taking art classes once her treatment was complete. The transformation from dying woman to cancer survivor had happened so quickly that Zara sometimes felt like she'd stepped into someone else's life. Her role as Kim Jae-won's personal assistant had settled into a routine that was surprisingly normal considering who her employer was and what his reputation suggested. Most days she arrived at his Gangnam office by 9 in the morning to review his schedule, coordinate meetings with international clients, and handle correspondence that required translation between Korean, Japanese, and English. His legitimate business interests were extensive and complex. Real estate development projects throughout Southeast Asia, technology investments in startup companies, import-export operations that dealt with everything from luxury goods to industrial equipment. Kim Jae-won was a demanding but considerate employer. He expected perfection but provided the resources to achieve it. He required discretion but never asked her to do anything that violated her principles. He worked long hours but respected her need for personal time and family obligations. The dangerous criminal she'd expected to encounter never materialized. Instead, she worked with a businessman who happened to operate in industries where legal and illegal activities sometimes overlapped in ways that required careful navigation. The surprising part was how much she'd come to enjoy his company. Kim Jae-won was intelligent, well-traveled, and genuinely interested in her opinions about everything from international currency fluctuations to the best restaurants in neighborhoods he'd never visited. He spoke 5 languages fluently, had visited every continent except Antarctica, and could discuss art, literature, politics, and philosophy with equal knowledge and insight. He also had a gentleness that contradicted his reputation and completely dismantled her preconceptions about men who commanded criminal organizations. She'd watched him spend 20 minutes patiently helping an elderly restaurant owner understand a complicated city permit application, speaking in slow, careful Korean, and taking notes to follow up with the appropriate officials. She'd seen him anonymously pay medical bills for families who couldn't afford treatment, transferring money with the same casual efficiency that most people used to tip delivery drivers. Most evenings, they shared dinner either at his office or at one of the understated restaurants he preferred, places that served exceptional food without flashy presentation or celebrity clientele. These meals had become the part of her day she looked forward to most, conversations that ranged from serious discussions about business strategy to surprisingly personal exchanges about their families, their goals, their experiences growing up in completely different worlds. Tonight, they were dining at his penthouse, a space she'd visited several times for business meetings, but never for purely social occasions. The penthouse was different from his office, warmer, more personal, with art that reflected individual taste rather than corporate image. Original paintings by Korean artists lined the walls, photographs of landscapes from around the world were displayed on custom shelves, and books in multiple languages filled cases that suggested they were read rather than merely decorative. Kim Jae-won was cooking, something she'd never expected to see from a man who could afford to hire teams of professional chefs. He moved around the kitchen with the same controlled precision he brought to everything else, but there was something relaxed about his posture, something domestic and unexpectedly intimate about watching him prepare food for her. "You're surprised," he observed, glancing up from the vegetables he was cutting with chef-level knife skills. "I didn't expect you to cook." Zara was sitting at the counter that separated the kitchen from the main living area, nursing a glass of wine that probably cost more than her old monthly grocery budget. "Most people in your position hire staff for everything. I enjoy cooking. It's meditative. Chopping vegetables, timing different dishes, creating something nourishing from simple ingredients." Kim Jae-won's movements were rhythmic, precise, almost hypnotic to watch. "Plus, I learned early that feeding someone is one of the most basic forms of care. From your mother." Something shifted in his expression, a shadow that suggested painful memories. "She died when I was 14. Car accident. After that, it was just me and my younger sister, and I had to learn to take care of both of us. That must have been difficult, managing household responsibilities while still being a child yourself. I grew up fast." Kim Jae-won's knife work slowed slightly, his attention divided between the food preparation and the conversation. "Maybe too fast. I focused on providing, on making money, on building security. I thought that was the most important kind of care. But it wasn't. Not always." He set down the knife and looked directly at her, his dark eyes serious and intent. "Sometimes the most important care is simply being present, paying attention, noticing when someone you love is in trouble before it's too late to help." The words carried weight that suggested personal experience with failure, with regret, with the kind of mistakes that left lasting scars. Zara waited, sensing that he was deciding whether to share something important, something that would explain the careful way he watched over her and her family. "My sister's name was Jean A.E. Kim Jae-won's voice was quiet but steady, each word carefully controlled. "She was 5 years younger than me, sweet and trusting and everything good about the world. When she was 19, she met a man. Park Hyun-soo. He seemed decent, polite, the kind of boyfriend that older brothers approve of. But he wasn't. He was charming for 6 months. Flowers, expensive dinners, thoughtful gifts, perfect manners with family members." Kim Jae-won's hands stilled completely, his gaze focused on something beyond the present moment. "I was building my business then, working 18-hour days, traveling constantly. I was proud that she had someone who seemed to care about her, someone who made her happy." What changed? The control started gradually. Comments about her clothes being too revealing, suggestions that her friends were bad influences, requests that she spend more time with him and less with other people. Kim Jae-won's voice remained level, but tension was building in his shoulders, in the careful way he held himself. Then came the isolation. Convincing her to quit her job, to move in with him, to cut contact with friends who asked too many questions. "And you didn't notice. I was too busy making money to pay attention to whether she was happy. I thought providing financial security was the same as protecting her." Kim Jae-won turned back to the stove, checking the rice, adjusting the heat under a pot of soup that smelled like comfort and home. "By the time I realized something was wrong, she was completely under his control." "How did you find out?" "She stopped answering my calls. Missed family dinners without explanation. When I finally went to their apartment, she had bruises that she tried to hide with makeup and long sleeves." Kim Jae-won's jaw tightened, muscle working under his skin as he controlled his reaction to the memory. She was afraid of him, but she was more afraid of what would happen if she tried to leave. "What did you do?" "I arranged for her to stay with relatives in Busan while I handled Park Hyun-soo. Made it clear that he was to have no contact with her, ever, under any circumstances." Kim Jae-won's voice carried undertones that suggested his handling of the situation had been comprehensive and permanent. "I thought she was safe, but she went back to him. 3 weeks later. She said she loved him, that he'd promised to change, that I didn't understand their relationship." Kim Jae-won set down the wooden spoon he'd been using to stir the soup, his movements careful and controlled despite the emotion in his voice. "I should have done more. Should have ignored her protests, kept her safe against her will, made sure she couldn't return to him. You can't force someone to accept help they don't want. You can when the alternative is letting them die." Kim Jae-won's control cracked slightly, revealing the pain and guilt underneath his composed exterior. 6 months later, Park Hyun-soo killed her. Beat her to death in their apartment during an argument about her wanting to visit family for the holidays. Zara felt the breath catch in her throat, the casual warmth of the evening suddenly displaced by the weight of his confession. "I'm so sorry." That's not something you ever recover from. You don't recover. You learn to live with the failure. Kim Jae-won turned to face her fully, his dark eyes holding hers with intensity that felt like a physical connection. You accept that your priorities were wrong, that providing money isn't the same as providing protection, that being too busy to notice when someone you love is in danger is a luxury that costs lives. Is that why you help women like me? Because you couldn't save her? Partly. Kim Jae-won moved closer, close enough that she could see the pain that he kept carefully controlled, the guilt that drove his protective instincts. But also because I learned that some people are worth saving, and having the power to help means having the responsibility to act. You didn't know I was worth saving when you first met me. I knew you chose integrity over opportunity when you could have exploited information for money. I knew you were working yourself to exhaustion to care for family. I knew you were the kind of person who returns lost items even when no one is watching. Kim Jae-won's voice was gentle but certain. That was enough. The admission hung between them, creating an intimacy that changed the atmosphere in the room. Zara understood now why he'd been watching over her, why he'd appeared at exactly the right moment to save her from Lee Min-wo, why his protection felt personal rather than merely professional. You blame yourself for her death. Every day? Kim Jae-won's honesty was stark, unguarded in a way she'd never seen from him before. If I'd paid attention, if I'd prioritized her safety over business expansion, if I'd been less focused on making money and more focused on being a brother, she would still be alive. You couldn't have known he would become violent. I should have known. Kim Jae-won reached across the counter, his hand covering hers with gentle warmth that sent awareness through her entire body. I had resources, connections, the ability to investigate anyone in her life. I chose not to use them because I was too busy building an empire to notice she was being destroyed. So now you use those resources to protect other women. Now I pay attention. Kim Jae-won's thumb traced across her knuckles, a touch that was careful and reverent and completely focused on her reaction. I notice when someone is in danger, when they need help, when they're worth saving. I don't let the people I care about face threats alone. The word care resonated in the space between them, loaded with meaning that went beyond professional interest or charitable impulse. Zara looked into his eyes and saw something that made her heart beat faster, something that transformed her understanding of their relationship from employment arrangement to something deeper and more complex. You care about me, more than I should, more than is professional, more than is safe for either of us. Kim Jae-won's admission was quiet but absolute, changing everything about how she interpreted his attention, his protection, his careful consideration of her needs and preferences. Why is it not safe? Because caring about someone makes them a target. Because my world includes people who would hurt you to get to me. Because the more important you become, the more danger you face simply by being in my life. But you hired me anyway. I hired you because I couldn't stay away from you, and employment was the only acceptable reason to keep you close. Kim Jae-won's honesty was devastating in its simplicity. I told myself it was about protection, about providing help you needed. But the truth is I wanted you in my life, and this was the only way that didn't compromise your independence or your safety. What about now? Zara's voice was barely above a whisper, her awareness of him as a man rather than an employer becoming impossible to ignore. Has that changed? Now I know that you're exactly what I thought you were when I first met you. Intelligent, strong, loyal, worth protecting. Kim Jae-won's eyes searched her face, looking for something she wasn't sure she was ready to reveal. And now I know that professional distance is becoming impossible to maintain. The admission created electric tension between them, acknowledgement of attraction that had been building for weeks through shared meals, long conversations, and the growing comfort of working closely together. Zara realized that somewhere in the past 2 months, Kim Jae-won had stopped being her intimidating criminal employer and had become the man she looked forward to seeing every day, the person whose approval mattered more than anyone else's, the presence that made her feel safe in a way she'd never experienced before. What does that mean for us? It means that you should know that my feelings for you have nothing to do with our employment arrangement. Kim Jae-won's voice was careful but determined. You're not obligated to reciprocate, and your job security doesn't depend on your response. But I needed you to understand that protecting you isn't just professional responsibility anymore. What is it? It's personal. It's emotional. It's the difference between keeping an employee safe and keeping someone I care about away from anything that could hurt them. Kim Jae-won's hand was still covering hers, warm and strong, and completely focused on her response. It's admitting that Jaine's death taught me to recognize when someone is worth fighting for, and you are worth everything I can provide. The confession settled between them with the weight of changed expectations and acknowledged feelings. Zara looked at this man who'd saved her from financial ruin, provided for her family's needs, and revealed his deepest wounds in order to explain why her safety mattered more than professional boundaries. She thought about the past 2 months of growing comfort, increasing trust, and the gradual realization that she'd begun measuring her days by whether she would see him. She thought about his gentleness with elderly restaurant owners, his anonymous charity, his careful attention to her preferences and needs. She thought about the way he looked at her during their evening conversations, the way his presence made everything seem manageable, the way his protection felt like being cherished rather than controlled. And she admitted to herself that somewhere in the process of working for Kim Jae-won, she'd fallen for him completely. "I care about you too," she said quietly. "More than is probably wise, considering who you are and what your life involves. Who I am is someone who will never let anything happen to you." Kim Jae-won's voice was steady, certain, a promise rather than a hope. "What my life involves is making sure that you and your family are safe, comfortable, and happy for as long as you'll allow me that privilege. What if I want more than protection? Then tell me what you want, and I'll find a way to provide it without compromising your safety or your choices. I want to stop pretending that this is just employment." Zara's heart was beating fast enough that she could hear it, but her voice was clear and certain. "I want to acknowledge that these dinners feel like dates, that I look forward to seeing you every day, that working for you has become the best part of my life." Kim Jae-won's smile was genuine and warm, transforming his controlled features into something that looked like joy. "Then we stop pretending. We acknowledge that this employment arrangement has become something else entirely, and we figure out what that means together." He moved around the counter to stand directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the careful hope in his dark eyes, close enough that the air between them felt charged with possibility and promise. "What it means," he continued quietly, "is that you're mine to protect, to care for, to cherish in whatever way you'll accept. And if you're willing, it means that I'm yours in whatever way you want me." The words settled around them like a declaration, acknowledgement that their relationship had evolved beyond anything either of them had planned. When he reached up to touch her face, his fingers gentle against her skin, Zara leaned into the contact and let herself admit that falling for Kim Jae-won had been inevitable from the moment he'd chosen to protect her instead of silencing her. Whatever dangers came with loving a man like him, whatever complications arose from mixing personal and professional relationships, whatever moral ambiguities emerged from caring about someone whose business operated in gray areas of legality, she was certain of one thing: she was exactly where she belonged. The first sign something was wrong came during Zara's Tuesday morning visit to her mother's oncology appointment. As they waited in the pristine hospital lobby, she noticed the same man in a dark jacket she'd seen outside her apartment building the previous evening, casually reading a newspaper while positioned to observe everyone entering and leaving the medical center. When she mentioned it to her mother, the man folded his paper and disappeared through the revolving doors, but the prickle of unease that settled between her shoulder blades remained throughout the entire appointment. That afternoon, Kim Jae-won's driver reported unusual activity around the Gangnam office building. Security cameras had recorded the same vehicle circling the block multiple times during hours when legitimate business traffic was minimal. The license plate belonged to a rental car company known for handling cash transactions without requiring extensive identification verification. Kim Jae-won increased her security detail immediately, assigning 2 additional bodyguards who maintained discreet distance but constant vigilance. By Thursday, the surveillance had become obvious enough that even her mother noticed strange men lingering near the hospital entrance, in the parking garage, outside the pharmacy where she collected prescription medications. Zara felt like she was living in a fishbowl, watched and evaluated by people whose intentions she couldn't determine but whose presence felt increasingly threatening. Kim Jae-won's response was swift and comprehensive. He relocated her mother to a private medical facility with military-grade security, arranged for armed escorts to accompany Zara anywhere outside the office building, and activated what he called enhanced protective protocols that involved people she never saw, but whose presence she could feel like invisible shields. The explanation came Friday evening in his office, delivered with the calm precision he brought to all crisis management, but tinged with something that looked like barely controlled rage. "Park Min-soo," he said, sliding a surveillance photograph across his desk. "Leader of the Crimson Dragon Syndicate, my primary competitor for shipping contracts and territory control in southern Seoul. We've maintained an uneasy peace for 3 years, but recent developments suggest he's decided to test my resolve." Recent developments meaning what exactly? Meaning you. Kim Jae-won's dark eyes were harder than she'd ever seen them, ice cold and utterly focused. "He's identified you as someone important to me, someone whose safety I value more than business considerations. In his mind, that makes you a weakness he can exploit. How did he identify me as important? Because I've been careless about hiding how much you matter." Kim Jae-won's admission carried self-recrimination and anger directed inward. "Because I changed my behavior patterns to accommodate your schedule, moved meetings to ensure I could have dinner with you, refused business opportunities that would require extended travel away from Seoul. Because anyone watching closely would recognize that Kim Jae-won doesn't alter his priorities for mere employees. So he knows we're involved personally. He knows you're more than a business arrangement. Whether he understands the exact nature of our relationship is irrelevant." Kim Jae-won stood and moved to the window, his controlled tension evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. "What matters is that he's targeting you to force my hand in territorial negotiations." "What kind of targeting?" "Intimidation through surveillance, possible kidnapping for leverage, potential violence to prove his capabilities." Kim Jae-won's voice remained level but carried undertones that suggested Park Min-soo's capabilities were extensive and dangerous. "He wants to demonstrate that I can't protect what matters to me, that my power has limits, that crossing him carries personal consequences. Can you stop him? I can eliminate him permanently, but that would trigger a war that would endanger everyone in my organization and potentially hurt innocent people caught in the crossfire." Kim Jae-won turned back to face her, his expression grim but determined. "The preferable solution is to demonstrate that threatening you is more dangerous than any territorial dispute is worth." "How do we do that?" "We increase security, limit your exposure, and wait for him to make a move significant enough to justify overwhelming response without triggering larger conflict." Kim Jae-won's plan was logical, professional, the kind of strategic thinking that had built his organization into a regional power. Unfortunately, it also required using you as bait to draw him into a position where I can neutralize the threat completely. I don't want to be bait. Neither do I. But the alternative is eliminating Park Min-soo preemptively, which would destabilize the entire criminal ecosystem in Seoul and potentially harm hundreds of people who depend on the current balance of power for their livelihoods. Saturday morning, Zara accompanied her mother to what should have been a routine chemotherapy session at the new private medical facility. The security was impressive. Armed guards at every entrance, metal detectors, background checks for all staff, protocols that would have been appropriate for protecting government officials rather than cancer patients. She felt safe, protected, surrounded by people whose job was ensuring nothing harmful could reach her or her family. The attack came during the transition between the medical building and the parking garage, a precisely timed operation that exploited the brief window when they were moving between secure locations. 5 men in medical uniforms appeared simultaneously from different directions, their movements coordinated and professional. Her bodyguards reacted immediately, but they were outnumbered and caught in a position where returning fire would endanger hospital patients and staff. Zara's blood turned to ice as she recognized the setup. These weren't random criminals looking for quick profit. These were professionals executing a planned kidnapping operation designed to capture her without harming her mother or creating excessive collateral damage. "Get down," her lead bodyguard shouted, drawing his weapon while positioning himself between Zara and the approaching threats. She pulled her mother behind a concrete pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her throat. This was the moment Kim Jae-won had warned her about, the test of whether his protection was sufficient against someone who wanted to hurt her specifically. The gunfight lasted less than 30 seconds. Her bodyguards were skilled and well-positioned, but the attackers had planned for armed resistance. Smoke grenades filled the parking garage with thick chemical fog that burned her eyes and made breathing difficult. When hands grabbed her from behind, she tried to scream, but something covered her face with fabric that smelled like hospital disinfectant and made consciousness fade despite her attempts to fight. She woke up in a windowless room that smelled like concrete and motor oil, her hands zip-tied behind her back, her head pounding from whatever drug they'd used to keep her unconscious during transport. The space was industrial, probably a warehouse or storage facility, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everything look stark and unforgiving. Park Min-soo was waiting for her to regain consciousness, a man in his 50s with expensive clothes and predatory eyes that evaluated her like she was merchandise rather than a person. Two other men flanked him, both armed, both watching her with the kind of attention that suggested violence was a realistic possibility. "Miss Thompson," Park Min-soo said in accented English, his voice polite but carrying undertones that made her skin crawl. "I apologize for the dramatic introduction, but Kim Jae-won is a difficult man to reach through conventional channels. What do you want?" "I want him to understand that his recent territorial expansions into my business districts come with personal costs." Park Min-soo settled into a chair positioned just close enough to make her uncomfortable, just far enough to remain outside any potential retaliation if she managed to free herself. "You represent those personal costs. He'll come for me." "Of course he will. That's exactly what I'm counting on." Park Min-soo smiled, an expression that held no warmth or humor. "The question is what condition you'll be in when he arrives, and what he'll be willing to sacrifice to ensure your safety." "I don't know anything about his business operations." Zara kept her voice steady despite the terror flooding her system. "I'm just an administrative assistant." "You're much more than that, Miss Thompson. You're the weakness that makes Kim Jae-won human, the vulnerability that proves even the most dangerous men have pressure points." Park Min-soo leaned forward slightly, his attention focused on her face with uncomfortable intensity. "Do you know how many people he's killed to build his empire?" "No." 43 confirmed deaths over the past 10 years. Men who crossed him, competitors who challenged his authority, enemies who threatened his interests. Kim Jae-won is not a businessman who occasionally breaks laws. He's a killer who owns legitimate businesses as convenient cover. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand exactly who you're sleeping with when he comes to rescue you." Park Min-soo's words were designed to hurt, to plant doubt about Kim Jae-won's character, to make her question the relationship that had become the center of her world. "Your devoted protector has tortured people for information, eliminated entire families to send messages, destroyed lives without hesitation when it served his purposes." "I don't believe you." 6 months ago, a man named Chun Wei-ming attempted to steal a shipment of pharmaceuticals from one of Kim Jae-won's legitimate import operations. Park Min-soo pulled out a tablet and showed her photographs that made her stomach turn, images of violence that she couldn't process fully, but that suggested extreme brutality. Kim Jae-won didn't just kill him. He made an example that would discourage future theft. Chun Wei-ming's wife and 2 children were found 3 days later. "You're lying. I'm educating you about the man whose bed you share and whose protection you depend on." Park Min-soo's voice carried mock sympathy that felt like psychological torture. "When he arrives to rescue you, remember that the violence he uses isn't justified by noble motives. It's simply what he does to maintain power and control." The hours that followed were a careful campaign of psychological warfare designed to break her faith in Kim Jae-won and her understanding of their relationship. Park Min-soo provided detailed accounts of violent operations, showed her evidence of criminal activities that went beyond the gray area business she'd imagined, forced her to confront the reality that the man she'd fallen in love with was capable of brutality that normal people couldn't comprehend. But he also made the mistake of threatening her family. When he described his plans to target her mother, her cousins, anyone connected to her life, Zara understood that Kim Jae-won's violence wasn't randomly cruel. It was specifically protective, directed at people who threatened the things he cared about. She thought about his sister Jin-hee, about his guilt over failing to protect someone he loved, about his careful attention to her safety and his family's well-being. Park Min-soo was trying to convince her that Kim Jae-won's darkness was a character flaw, but what if it was actually what made him capable of keeping her safe in a world where people like Park Min-soo existed. The rescue came during what Park Min-soo had calculated as Kim Jae-won's maximum desperation point, 6 hours after her disappearance when negotiations would favor the kidnapper over the victim's family. The warehouse erupted into chaos with military precision. Smoke, gunfire, shouted commands in Korean, and the kind of overwhelming force that suggested extensive planning and unlimited resources. Park Min-soo's men were neutralized within minutes, their professional confidence no match for Kim Jae-won's organizational capabilities and personal motivation. When the smoke cleared, Park Min-soo was unconscious, his associates were dead or restrained, and Kim Jae-won was cutting the zip ties from her wrists with hands that trembled slightly despite his controlled exterior. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice carefully gentle despite the violence that surrounded them. "Scared but not injured." Zara's relief at seeing him was so overwhelming that she started crying, all the terror and uncertainty of the past 6 hours releasing at once. "He threatened my family. He won't threaten anyone ever again." Kim Jae-won's promise was absolute, carrying the weight of someone who had the power and willingness to make good on it. "Can you walk?" "I think so." She stood on shaky legs, noting that the warehouse was now filled with Kim Jae-won's people, all armed, all focused on cleanup operations that would leave no evidence of what had transpired. The ride back to his penthouse was silent, Kim Jae-won's controlled tension filling the car like electricity. His jaw was tight, his hands clenched, his attention divided between monitoring her condition and managing whatever rage was building beneath his composed exterior. Once they reached the safety of his private space, his control finally cracked. "I thought I'd lost you," he said, pulling her into his arms with desperate intensity. 6 hours of not knowing if you were alive, if they were hurting you, if I would be too late to save you. But you found me." Zara pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of his cologne and the solid warmth that meant safety and home. "You saved me. This time." Kim Jae-won's arms tightened around her, his voice rough with emotion and exhaustion. "But there will be others like Park Min-soo. Other people who think they can use you to get to me. I can't protect you from a distance anymore." "What does that mean?" "It means you're mine now, completely. Not just during business hours, not just when it's convenient, not just until you decide you want a different life." Kim Jae-won pulled back to look at her face, his dark eyes intense and possessive and utterly focused on her response. "You're mine to protect, to guard, to keep safe from anyone who would use you against me." The words should have been frightening, possessive in a way that suggested control rather than love. But after 6 hours of genuine terror, after being forced to confront the reality of what loving Kim Jae-won meant for her safety, the promise of complete protection felt like salvation rather than imprisonment. "I'm yours," she agreed, reaching up to touch his face, feeling the tension in his jaw, the careful control he maintained even in moments of emotional intensity. "Broken pieces and all." "You're not broken." Kim Jae-won's hands cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "You're perfect, you're precious, and you're never going to face danger alone again." When he kissed her, it was with the desperation of someone who'd thought he might never have the chance again. The intensity of 6 hours of fear and rage and relief compressed into physical connection. Zara kissed him back with equal desperation, needing to feel alive and safe and cherished after being reduced to nothing more than leverage in someone else's game. "Tomorrow we move you to the estate," Kim Jae-won said against her lips. "Complete security, trained staff, protection that makes today's attack impossible to repeat." "What about my independence?" "Your independence is a luxury I can't afford when it puts your life at risk." His honesty was brutal but necessary. "I won't apologize for choosing your safety over your freedom when the alternative is finding your body because I respected your autonomy more than I valued your life." The words were stark, possessive, the kind of statement that redefined their relationship from equal partnership to protective custody. But after experiencing firsthand what Kim Jae-won's enemies were willing to do, after being forced to confront the reality of the dangerous world she'd entered, Zara found herself grateful for his possessiveness rather than threatened by it. She was his to protect now, completely and permanently, and for the first time since Park Min-soo had threatened her family, she felt truly safe. 3 weeks after the warehouse rescue, Zara stood in the gardens of Kim Jae-won's private estate watching her mother tend to orchids in the custom greenhouse that had been built specifically for her rehabilitation therapy. The estate sprawled across 15 acres of manicured landscape in Seoul's most exclusive district, surrounded by walls that looked decorative but contained security technology that made the property impenetrable to anyone without authorized access. Her mother moved with energy that would have been impossible 4 months ago, her hair growing back in silver waves, her cheeks pink with health and genuine happiness. The threat from Park Min-soo had been eliminated with the same thorough efficiency that Kim Jae-won brought to all business operations. Park Min-soo himself had disappeared the night of the rescue, along with his primary lieutenants and the organizational structure that had supported his criminal enterprise. Rival syndicates had absorbed his former territories within days, grateful for Kim Jae-won's restraint in not expanding his own operations into the power vacuum. The message had been delivered clearly. Targeting Kim Jae-won's family carried consequences that extended far beyond simple retaliation. Zara's family had been relocated to a guest house on the estate grounds, a beautiful traditional Korean home with modern amenities and round-the-clock security that felt like luxury rather than imprisonment. Her mother had initially protested the disruption to her independence, but the combination of world-class medical care, beautiful surroundings, and her daughter's obvious happiness had overcome her reservations about accepting help from a man whose reputation she understood but chose not to examine too closely. The guest house had become a gathering place for family members who visited regularly, drawn by the security and comfort, but staying because of the warmth that had developed between Kim Jae-won and the people Zara loved most. He treated her mother with the reverence he might have shown his own, consulting her about garden design and traditional cooking techniques, ensuring her medical appointments were scheduled with the best specialists in Seoul, providing resources for the art classes she'd mentioned wanting to take once her treatment was complete. This evening, they were alone in his study, a room lined with books in multiple languages and decorated with art that reflected his travels and personal taste rather than corporate image. The space felt intimate, personal, designed for conversation and contemplation rather than business meetings or formal negotiations. Kim Jae-won sat across from her in leather chairs positioned near the window that overlooked the gardens, both of them nursing wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. "Your mother looks happy," he observed, following her gaze toward the greenhouse where her mother was photographing her favorite orchid blooms in the golden evening light. "She is happy, happier than she's been since before the cancer diagnosis." Zara turned her attention back to Kim Jae-won, noting the satisfaction in his expression, the way he took genuine pleasure in her family's well-being. "Thank you for making that possible. Thank you for letting me make it possible." Kim Jae-won's response carried weight that suggested gratitude rather than mere politeness. "Providing for your family gives me purpose beyond business expansion and territory control. It reminds me that power should be used to protect people worth caring about." "Is that what I am? Worth caring about?" "You're more than that." Kim Jae-won set down his wine glass and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his with the careful attention he brought to everything that mattered to him. "You're the person I want to build a life with, the woman I want to wake up beside for the next 50 years, the future I want more than any business success or criminal achievement." The words were spoken with quiet intensity, not romantic declaration but statement of fact, inevitability rather than hope. Zara looked into his dark eyes and saw absolute certainty, the same controlled determination he brought to eliminating threats and protecting the people he loved. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I want you as my wife, not just under my protection." Kim Jae-won's voice was steady but carried emotion that made her heart beat faster. "I want you as the official partner of Kim Jae-won, the woman who stands beside me in everything I build, the person whose name is legally connected to mine permanently." Marriage. Traditional Korean wedding ceremony followed by legal registration that makes you my heir, my next of kin, my legally recognized family. Kim Jae-won reached into his jacket and pulled out a small velvet box that looked antique, expensive, significant. "Complete financial security for your family, legal protections that extend to everyone you care about, and my name that carries enough power and soul to ensure no one ever threatens your safety again." He opened the box to reveal a ring that made her breath catch. The center stone was a flawless diamond surrounded by smaller stones that caught the light and threw rainbows across the dark wood of his desk. The setting was platinum, elegant but substantial, clearly valuable, but designed for daily wear rather than special occasions. "This belonged to my grandmother," Kim Jae-won said quietly. "The only thing I kept from before my parents died, before I built this empire, before I became someone whose name carries fear as well as respect. It represents the part of my life that was innocent, the family connections that existed before violence and criminal activity became necessary for survival. It's beautiful. It's yours." Kim Jae-won removed the ring from the box with careful reverence, holding it poised above her finger while waiting for her response. "If you're willing to accept not just the ring, but everything it represents. Marriage to someone whose business involves activities you don't fully understand, protection that comes with restrictions on your freedom, a life that will always include security concerns and potential dangers. What about children? I want children with you. Sons and daughters who grow up safe and loved and never experience the kind of loss that shaped my childhood." Kim Jae-won's smile was genuine and warm, transforming his controlled features into something that looked like pure happiness. Children who have everything they need, who are protected by resources that ensure they never face the kind of desperation that forced you into impossible choices. And your business, the illegal activities. I'm transitioning to completely legitimate operations over the next 3 years. Kim Jae-won's plan was clearly something he'd thought through extensively, detailed and comprehensive. Real estate development, technology investments, import businesses that operate entirely within legal boundaries. The reputation and connections I've built can support legitimate enterprises that provide the same financial returns without the moral compromises or security risks. You would do that for me. I would do that for us. For our children, for the kind of legacy I want to leave, for the man I want to become rather than the man I had to be for survival. Kim Jae-won's honesty was devastating in its completeness. "You make me want to be someone worthy of the love you've given me. Someone whose protection comes from legitimate power rather than fear and violence." Zara looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the future being offered with such careful certainty. She thought about her life 4 months ago, working double shifts at a hotel, drowning in medical bills, desperate enough to consider loan sharks and human traffickers. She thought about the woman who'd walked into the wrong VIP lounge and met a man who'd transformed every aspect of her existence. She thought about the past 3 weeks living in complete security, watching her mother regain health and happiness, experiencing the kind of protection that made dangers like Park Min-soo manageable rather than terrifying. She thought about Kim Jae-won's careful attention to her needs, his genuine care for her family, his willingness to change fundamental aspects of his life to build something clean and safe with her. "Yes," she said simply. "I want to marry you. I want your name, your protection, your children, your legitimate business empire, and your grandmother's ring." Kim Jae-won slipped the ring onto her finger with reverent precision, the platinum warm against her skin, the diamond catching light like captured stars. The fit was perfect, as if it had been waiting for her specifically, as if his grandmother's jewelry had been preserved for exactly this moment. "When?" she asked. 6 months. Traditional Korean ceremony followed by legal registration and celebration with both our families. Kim Jae-won's planning was characteristically thorough. "Time for you to learn Korean wedding customs, for the security arrangements to be finalized, for my business transition to be publicly announced, so our marriage represents clean, legitimate success rather than criminal partnership. Where will we live? Here, on the estate, in the main house with your family nearby, and security that ensures our children grow up completely safe." Kim Jae-won gestured toward the windows that showed the beautiful grounds, the guest house where her mother was probably preparing tea and reading before bed, the gardens that would become playground space for the family they would build together. The months that followed passed in a blur of wedding preparations, business transitions, and legal arrangements that secured her family's future in ways that went beyond simple financial support. Kim Jae-won established trust funds that would provide for her mother's medical care permanently, educational funds for any children they might have, and legal protections that made her an official partner in his legitimate business enterprises rather than merely a dependent spouse. The wedding ceremony took place in the estate gardens on a perfect spring morning when the cherry blossoms were in full bloom and the air smelled like flowers and new beginnings. Zara wore a traditional Korean hanbok in deep red silk embroidered with gold threads that caught the sunlight, her hair styled in elaborate braids decorated with ornamental pins that had belonged to Kim Jae-won's grandmother. The dress was heavy, formal, beautiful in ways that made her feel like royalty rather than a former hotel employee marrying into criminal royalty. Kim Jae-won wore traditional Korean formal attire that emphasized his broad shoulders and commanding presence, while somehow making him look younger, softer, more like the man she'd fallen in love with during quiet dinners and conversations about their dreams for the future. When he looked at her during the ceremony, his expression held wonder and gratitude and absolute devotion that made her feel like the most precious person in the world. The ceremony itself was a blend of traditional Korean customs and modern elements that reflected their specific situation. Both families attended, her mother radiant with health and happiness, his business associates respectful and genuinely pleased to celebrate with their boss. The vows were spoken in both Korean and English, promises of protection, loyalty, love, and partnership that felt like sacred contracts rather than romantic sentiment. When the officiant pronounced them married, when Kim Jae-won kissed her with gentle reverence while their families applauded, when she realized that she was now officially Mrs. Kim Jae-won, with all the security and protection that name carried, Zara felt like she'd completed a journey from desperation to absolute safety. The reception continued into the evening with traditional Korean music, exceptional food, and toasts that celebrated not just their marriage but the future they would build together. Kim Jae-won's associates spoke about his transition to legitimate business. Her family shared stories about the transformation in their security and happiness, and everyone present seemed to understand that they were witnessing something significant, the successful evolution from criminal necessity to legitimate success. That night, in their bedroom in the main house that was now officially their shared home, Zara stood before the mirror removing the ornamental pins from her hair, while Kim Jae-won watched with the same careful attention he'd given her since the day they met. "Any regrets?" he asked quietly. "About marrying you?" "None." "About walking into that VIP lounge 4 months ago?" "None." Zara turned to face him, noting how the formal wedding attire had been replaced by simple clothes that made him look domestic, approachable, like a husband rather than a crime boss. "About accepting your protection, your money, your name, your complete reorganization of my life?" "None whatsoever. Even knowing everything you know now about who I was, what I did, the violence I was capable of when it served my purposes. Especially knowing that." Zara moved closer to him, close enough to see the careful hope in his dark eyes, the way he still seemed surprised that she'd chosen to stay despite learning the complete truth about his past. Because that violence was never random, never cruel for its own sake. It was always protective, always directed at people who threatened the things you cared about. "And now what I care about most is you. And now what you care about most is completely safe, completely protected, completely yours." Zara reached up to touch his face, feeling the slight roughness of his jaw, the warmth of his skin, the solid reality of the man who'd transformed her from desperate hotel employee to protected crime boss wife. "Forever and always." "Forever and always," Kim Jae-won agreed, pulling her into his arms with the same desperate gratitude he'd shown the night he rescued her from the warehouse, the same careful reverence he brought to everything that mattered to him. Later, as they lay together in their bedroom that overlooked the gardens where her mother would tend orchids tomorrow, where their children would play in complete safety, where they would build a life that combined legitimate success with uncompromising protection, Zara thought about the journey that had brought them here. She'd walked into the wrong VIP lounge 4 months ago, desperate and drowning and willing to consider options that her previous life would have rejected without question. She'd met a dangerous man who'd offered salvation wrapped in moral complexity, protection that came with possession, security that required surrender of independence. And she'd found exactly where she belonged, in the arms of someone powerful enough to eliminate every threat, wealthy enough to solve every problem, devoted enough to reorganize his entire life around her happiness and safety. Mrs. Kim Jae-won, wife of Seoul's most powerful legitimate businessman, Mother of children who would grow up with every advantage. Woman whose name carried enough respect to ensure she never faced another desperate choice again. She'd walked into the wrong room and discovered it had been the right room all along.